All right, we're going to look at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, specifically the start of it in England, and see how that really transforms English society initially, but eventually it will have an impact across all of Europe and, in fact, across all of the world. So let's look at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The beginnings of this revolution, it starts in England and Great Britain for four real major reasons. The first is this expanding Atlantic economy. So we've talked before about the Columbian Exchange, about triangle trade, but you really have this continuing to grow as the colonies and soon to be independent nations in the Americas continue to grow in population. They start to demand more and more material goods. And so there's this need to produce more. So that's one of the reasons. But another is that because Great Britain is so central in this Atlantic economy, they have access to tons of raw material. You'll recall the Navigation Acts, which said that British goods had to be transported on British ships, and also it prohibited the American colonies from trading with anyone other than Great Britain. That means that all 13 colonies, Canada, any Caribbean colonies, had to only trade with Great Britain, which gives Great Britain access to tons of raw material and natural resources that other countries simply didn't have access to. They didn't have the cotton, the timber, the tobacco, or other things like that Great Britain did. And so this gives Great Britain a significant advantage in that they have a whole bunch more markets, but also a lot more natural resources and raw materials than any other country did. The second reason is the agricultural revolution, and that really begins and takes off in Britain with the enclosure movement, and you see these new trial and errors with farming and new techniques that leads to increased agricultural production. And since there's more food and the food processes are more efficient, that really requires fewer people working in agriculture, which opens them up to other jobs. But it also allows for a greater food supply, more people to move to the cities. Britain also is unique at this time in that it has a real stable economy and a stable government. Throughout the continent of Europe, there's still a lot of wars going on. There's just transformation in government. In France, you have the French Revolution going on. Germany's still trying to unify. Italy's trying to unify. You kind of have all these fragmented things going on. But Britain was very solidly a constitutional monarchy following the Glorious Revolution of 1689. So they were pretty well entrenched in their ways with their stable government and stable economy. Because they were this island nation with access to the Atlantic economy, they had a stable economy and stable growth. And then the last thing is they had a ready supply of wage laborers. Again, these are all tied together. It goes back to this agricultural revolution. Since fewer people were needed in the fields, that opened them up to going to work in other jobs. And so that really is unique for Great Britain, and that they're able to have these laborers to put in the factories. So these four factors, the greater expanding Atlantic economy, which means more markets for good, more raw materials, the technological and agricultural production coming out of the agricultural revolution, significant. The fact that they had a stable economy and government is significant, and the fact that they have a huge population that works as wage laborers. All of these factors allow for Great Britain to host and begin this industrial revolution. Now we should probably talk about what the Industrial Revolution is. It's this transitional period in manufacturing from 1760 to about the 1840s, although you could argue it lasts longer than that. And it is during this time period that production and manufacturing moves out of the house from small-scale cottage industry into large-scale industrial factories that we recognize today. It is an era of new technology and new machines, constant innovation, in the way things are working and the way things are building. And it represents a radical social shift, both in population from country to city, but also it redefines kind of gender roles, and it redefines what it means to be a person, and it raises serious question about class consciousness as well as a number of other things. And we also see during this time the development of what we see as modern industry. And that is these giant factories with wage laborers slaving away on assembly lines. So this is kind of the crux of what's going on. This is the Industrial Revolution. And the initial factories, we have to look at how this starts off. It doesn't pop up overnight. There's a lot of things going on here. But it begins in the cotton textile industry. And it occurs in this industry due to a few technological advances, but it also occurs in this industry because Great Britain has tons of access to cotton markets in their American colonies, in their Indian colonies, and in Egypt. So they have lots of different access to cotton throughout this time period. So cotton's a big thing for them. But it also happens because of a few inventions. And one of them is John Hargreaves' the spinning jenny, which is just a different way of producing yarn. Basically, these allow for more yarn to be produced, which then means that instead of just going to these day laborers in the cottage industry, they have more materials than they're able to process. So they need to process it on a larger scale. And so you have Hargreaves spinning jenny, and then Richard Arkwright invents something called the water frame. And that's just kind of a complex system that allows for a higher output of cotton yarn. And this means that because there's so much yarn, they need more spinners. And so they start to pay these spinners pretty well, in fact. But they realize that this putting out system isn't going to work. They need to transition to a more centralized location. And so soon people are able to buy tons of yarn on the cheap, and then they're able to set up factories, basically big warehouses where they can house a bunch of these spinners to spin this into cloth and other textile goods. And initially people are reluctant to move here because wages are low and working conditions are terrible. People are used to working in the house, and then there's this other opportunity at these factories, and it's not super inviting. So they're struggling to fill their slots. As a result of this, the factory owners decide, well, if we can't find laborers through the normal labor supply pool, we'll go ahead and turn to these foundling homes and look at orphans as a potential labor supply. And they do this because they basically can rent out these orphans from the foundling homes or the parish houses where they're held. They can pay them almost nothing, just feed them and house them. So it's kind of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So they take these children off the hands of these foundling homes or other poorhouses, and they house them at the factory. In return, they get free labor, essentially. So these children are working and living at the factories. They're not really allowed to leave, and they're working 13 to 14-hour days. You can imagine a child of 7 or 8 working 13 to 14-hour days. You can imagine how miserable that would be. This was kind of accepted and common practices at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It ends up changing eventually, but this is where we're starting off in these initial factories. One problem they quickly run into is that their traditional supply of energy, and that is wood, runs out. And so people, concurrently with these new factories and all these things going on, they have to find a new source of energy and fuel. And so they quickly turn to coal. And they turn to coal because wood is running out. They used it for, and you can imagine how common wood was. It was used for building. It was used for fire, for heat, as well as for energy production, for any small factories or any metal making. They basically used wood for that. They used it for shipbuilding. They used it for crates. They used it for wheels. They used wood for basically everything. So you start to see that rapid deforestation is happening. And they're not just harvesting trees and replanting them. They're clearing the land and replacing it with farmland. And that leads to then a scarcity of wood in almost every country. And so they turn to a different source of energy. And Great Britain is very lucky that they have coal. And they have coal in great abundance. It naturally occurs in Britain at a very high rate. And so it replaces wood as the main source of energy because it's more efficient, it burns more efficiently, and you can actually, it's easier to dig it out of the ground than it is to kind of get a bunch of wood from a forest, which seems weird, but it's just a more efficient process, and because it burns longer and more efficiently, it's better to get coal than it is to get wood. They do run into a problem, though, and that is that as coal mines go deeper, they're flooded with this groundwater. And initially, they remove this groundwater with hand pumps and then with animal pumps where you have teams of oxen and horses kind of pulling this constant rotation of buckets. They're bucketing out the water. But the problem is that keeping up these animals is super expensive. You have to feed them, you have to make sure they're healthy, you have to handle them, you have to care for them, and they only can work at a certain rate. And even if you increase the number of animals, you increase the cost. and it's not really productive business-wise. It's an inefficient system. And because of this, you have, in this era of kind of the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, coming out of the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, you have people thinking about the world differently. And so you have people starting to tinker with machines and create new things. And the first person to create a steam engine is Thomas Newcomen. And he invents the steam engine for the simple fact of, hey, we've got to get this water out of these coal mines quicker. Otherwise, it's not worth the cost. And so he develops this really primitive steam engine that works, not really efficiently, but it's better than the oxen or horse strategy. And it's used initially just strictly to pump water out of these coal mines. And it just pumps, and it just pumps, and it just pumps, and it goes all day. And what we find is that during the 1760s, James Watt, he works on these steam engines. He's kind of a repairman, a mechanic. He comes up with a new way to make the steam engine significantly more efficient. And he kind of gets the go-ahead from his boss to tinker with these machines and change them. And so suddenly, the steam engine went from something that was more efficient but more costly and still not super efficient to something that was way more efficient than animals. And so you start to see everyone start to adopt this steam engine because it increases the output. Watt's improvement increases the output of energy, which means that less energy is being wasted. So you're spending less on these coals, you're making more money, and you have a really efficient steam engine. And one of the biggest initial growths because of this steam engine is the iron industry. The iron industry goes tremendously because they can use this steam engine to basically blow heat and increase their billows, and that creates things that are hotter, and they can more efficiently produce iron. So you see the iron growth. It grows almost exponentially as a result of this invention of the steam engine. Another really useful technology that comes out of this time and builds off the steam engine is the railroad. And the railroad really replaces the horse and wagon as the most efficient means of transportation. And the railroad is probably the most significant advancement made during the Industrial Revolution. It truly changes the way the world works. And the first effective locomotive, and locomotives have kind of been around for a while, but the first really effective one was created by George Stephenson, and it goes from the two main manufacturing industrial hubs of Manchester and Liverpool, both in England, and it chugs along at a real speedy 16 miles an hour, which to us might not sound like much, but when you can move tons of goods 16 miles an hour between cities, you're so much more efficient than horses, you're costing less to move it, you're safer, and you're getting there faster. And so this really revolutionizes the way that things are done and the way that things are transported between these two major cities. The other major result from this railroad is you have an increased market for these goods that are being produced. Before the railroad, anything that was made was kind of sold in a local area for the most part. Because you've got to imagine the cost of, if you're in San Diego and you manufacture something and you've got to get it to Chicago, if you have to take it there by horse and cart, it's going to be super expensive by the time it gets to Chicago because it's a long way to go. It takes a long time. You have to feed that horse a whole lot. So generally, things that were produced were sold in a local market within a day's journey or so. The railroad completely changes it. It opens the entire nation to goods that are made anywhere within that nation. So it really creates for the first time a national market because people are able to move their goods more cheaply and more efficiently and more quickly. And so you have people from all over the country buying from you rather than just locally. So that's kind of the biggest thing of the railroad. It also increases the demand for unskilled labor. They need people to lay these railroad tracks. That doesn't take a lot of skill, it just takes a lot of grunt work. And so you have this new demand for people doing this. And because of this, you have a new class of urban laborers who are kind of unskilled day laborers who sometimes might be building railroads or might be unloading things from the railroads. It helps create that new class that is further revolutionized during the Industrial Revolution and cemented during the Industrial Revolution. Another major effect of this Industrial Revolution is this huge growth in total population. And this is a cumulative effect of the Agricultural Revolution as well as the Industrial Revolution, plus some advances in medicine and relative peace. Although that doesn't really happen until after 1815. And what we see is this huge growth. And so the statistics given in your book are from a growth in total population of Britain from 9 million in 1780 to 21 million in 1854. I mean, that's double the population in 70 years. That's a huge difference. And the biggest areas of growth for population are in cities and industrial centers, because that's where the jobs are. And because people suddenly have jobs and there's more work to be had, people are more willing to have more children. Also, because there's this, before this, the legacy was to pass on to your children any land you had. So you could only divide land so many times before it basically became worthless or unable to sustain you. But now with these industrial revolutions, you're not passing on land to your children. So your children have their own opportunities to go make their own way in the world. So this major population growth occurs in the cities and industrial areas. And it's not just newborns, but there's also large immigration from the countryside to the city. Along with this, though, comes a few problems. And a couple of the people who voice these concerns are Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. And Thomas Malthus is an economist, and he argues for something called the Malthusian trap. And in this, he says that in human history, the population always grows faster than the food supply. It outpaces its growth. So the food supply grows kind of in a plodding, steady course while the population grows exponentially. As a result of this, you'll eventually see this overlap where there's more population than can be supplied with food. The result is starvation and awful death. Because of this, Malthus says that every now and then a good war, good disease, and sometimes some brief famines are good to help keep the population low. This will prevent worse starvation in the future. So that's something called the Malthusian trap. He's joined by another economist known as David Ricardo, and he writes something called the Iron Law of Wages. He says that as the population continues to grow, there are going to be more workers than there are jobs. Because of this, the factory owners could drive their wages down. And this means that as the population grows, wages will eventually sink to subsistence levels. That is, that wages will be just high enough to keep the workers from starving. They'll be able to feed themselves, but they won't be able to live a good quality life or even a healthy, nutritious life. So you have these kind of two men who at the outset of this Industrial Revolution are pointing to it and say, hey, this growth might not all be great. There may be some issues that we have to address in the future. And so those are two key people to keep in mind as we move forward in our study of the Industrial Revolution.